Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to MJH Live, the online public program series of New York's Museum of Jewish Heritage. My name is Samantha Shokin, Manager of Public Programs, and today we are joined by Sarah Abrevaya Stein and Clémence Boulouque for a discussion of Sarah's recent book, Family Papers, A Sephardic Journey Through the 20th Century. Sarah Stein is a historian, writer, and educator whose work has reshaped our understanding of Jewish history. At UCLA, she is a professor of history, the director of the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, as well as the Viterbi Family Chair in Mediterranean Jewish Studies. She is the author and editor of 9 books and has received many awards, including the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature, 2 National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowships, a Guggenheim Fellowship, 2 National Jewish Book Awards, and the UCLA Distinguished Teaching Award. Today, Sarah is joining us from Santa Monica. So hello and welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, pleasure to be here.
Great to have you here. And Clémence is the Carl and Bernice Witten Assistant Professor in Jewish and Israel Studies at Columbia University. Her interests include Jewish thought and mysticism, interreligious encounters, intellectual history, and networks with a focus on the modern Mediterranean and Sephardi worlds. Clémence was a Fulbright Scholar at Columbia at the School of International Affairs with a concentration on the Middle East. Prior to completing her PhD in Jewish Studies at NYU, she was a literary and movie critic in Paris. She is a published novelist and essayist in her native France. And today she is joining us from New York. So welcome, Clémence.
Thank you, Samantha. Good to be here.
It's great to have you both. Before we get started, I'd like to just remind our viewers that this program is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube in the coming days. And finally, we will have time for a brief Q&A session at the conclusion of the program. If you would like to participate in that session, please submit your questions into the chat box. So that's it for me. Thank you. And now please welcome Sarah and Clémence.
All right. So should we get, with no further ado, it is a great pleasure to be talking today about this wonderful book and to get a chance to explore those pages, literally letters and chapters of a history that's probably not as well known as it should be. So I want to start with the genesis of the project, Sarah. So the papers of the family, of the Levy family, are spread across 9 countries and 3 continents. I think we have a map of how the Levy family spread over, and they're written in 8 languages. So how did you come across this family, and how did you decide, and when did you decide that you wanted to tell the story?
Yeah, thank you. And I have to say, it's such a pleasure to be here virtually speaking with everyone. I hope everyone at home is safe and healthy and remains so. And Clémence, my thanks to you and to Samantha for this opportunity. So this book, Family Papers, came for me on the heels of another project. And that project was the translation with my dear friend and colleague, Erin Rodrigue, former teacher, with Isaac Drew Salmi of blessed memory serving as translator of what we understand to be the first Judeo-Spanish or Ladino language memoir ever written. And that memoir was written over the course of some decades in the city of Ottoman Salonica by a man whose full name was Saadi Besalel Ashkenazi Levy, and who was known by contemporaries as Saadi. And he was an unusual, an impassioned, and sometimes recalcitrant individual. He was an editor, he was a musician, a singer, a composer. He was a passionate thinker. He introduced to the city of Salonica the first modern newspapers in Ladino, Judeo-Spanish, the language of the Sephardic community, and also in French. And he wrote a memoir that historians knew existed because his sons, who worked with him in the family business of publishing, had, over the course of some decades, into the 1930s, published excerpts of this mythic memoir. But despite knowing that it existed, we had never seen it in full. And my colleague, Erin Rodrigue, discovered this manuscript in the Jewish National Library in Israel, associated with the Hebrew University. And we set out to bring it to an English reading public, not only because Saadi offers an incredibly unusual, clear-eyed, vivid, human-scale description of his community and his world of Ottoman Salonica, a world that was in flux. But also because for students who want to learn Ladino, and especially the unique handwritten cursive of Ladino, Salatreo, there are very few resources. So we set out with Isaac Drew Salmi upon this project. And as we finished bringing Saadi's words to life, and publishing it as a book entitled A Jewish Voice from Ottoman Salonica, I was left wondering what happened to his descendants. And that sometimes you ask a question as a scholar that it takes you years to answer. And it took me about a decade to answer that question of what happened. But it was a process of actually following his memoir in reverse, because the memoir that we translated, there was only one surviving handwritten copy. And it had journeyed from the city of Salonica, present-day Thessaloniki, Greece, to Paris, to Rio de Janeiro, and to Jerusalem. And my the first sort of piece of yarn that I pulled from this sweater was to go backwards to Rio, and with determination and some luck, was able to find the family there and the papers that they held. And from there began a really global journey of archival digging and research. Yes, it was a treasure hunt. In many ways it was, yeah.
And so what is the story that actually, I mean, first of all, it's an ode, like a tribute to letter writing, right? Because there are so many, none of this could be written today, I guess, obviously with the lack of permanence of emails. But what is the story that this family is telling us also?
It's a wonderful question to turn the focus on the letters, because I feel that the book has a number of topics at its heart. It's about a single family, a history of a single family over 6 or 7 generations. It's a history of Salonican Jewry. It's a history of the Sephardic diaspora. It's a history of global migration and the individual's experience of the modern world. But as you say, it's also really a history of letters. And one of the things I came to realize that historians can rarely peek at, but one of the things I came to realize is that this family, after distance had pulled them apart, migration had pulled them apart, their lives took them into many different national contexts, they spoke different languages, in some cases they practiced different religions. But one of the things that continued to hold them together over the century that I am exploring, which is really the century in which this homeland of Salonica fractured for Jews. Over this century, one of the forces that kept them together, even more than the tie of blood or of belief, was the force of letter writing. And especially, I would say, letter writing that was stimulated by one passionate letter writer, Leon Levy of Rio, who had the largest private collection of family papers that I discovered. Largest doesn't necessarily mean best, because there were other people who held on to very few documents or objects that were incredibly revealing and precious. But largest does mean most diverse, most complex. It gave me so many clues that I could then pursue to find branches of the family and people and stories all across the globe. So you said, Clémence, that letter writing is a lost art. And as I wrote this book, I really did think a lot about what it meant that in today's world, we actually produce a lot of words, a lot of text. We're constantly writing. But as you say, so much of what we write is fleeting and ephemeral. And for these people, letters were something different. They were something that you sat with for days, sometimes weeks before sending, and you waited to receive them, sometimes for weeks. Sometimes they would miss their mark altogether. So the entire relationship towards communication and towards writing, because of what letters meant for them, was very different, and I think much more thoughtful, and in some ways, as a result, much more intimate than the kind of feverish communications that we maintain today.
Right, which is also, I mean, it could be reflecting the way they engage with photography. There is also the sense of the preciousness, and that's, I mean, maybe it's no wonder that you included photographies also in the book, as if it was, I mean, those two arts were in dialogue.
They were, and what is so interesting to me is that families hold on to these things, even if they no longer can read the letters they are written in. The letters and the photographs, I think, are some of the last things that we are willing to get rid of, or that we lose. Of course, some things are lost to water, or to fire, or to mold, or to insects, or whatever else, or the chaos of lives torn up by war or displacement. But if one holds on to photographs, and one holds on to letters. I think there's something very primal about these things. That we understand, reveal, they open up a very rare window on the past.
So we'll return to those photographs, because we have
Lovely.
a couple that I'd like to share with the public today. You mentioned there are so many threads in this book, and it's so rich, but one of the threads is really the story of a place. That place that the historian Ahmad is also called City of Ghosts, so Salonica, and I understand that in the chat that there are many Salonica names, so people are surely aware of the history, but can you talk a little bit about that milieu that this family came from, and how things changed?
Of course. Sure. Well, I've written a great deal about Ottoman Jewry and Southeastern European Jewry, and Salonica is one of the distinctive centers of Sephardic Southeastern European Jewish culture, but it's also a distinctive city in the context of the Jewish world. Salonica was one of the largest ports of the Ottoman Empire. It was a kind of hinge between Europe and Asia. It was always, in the period I'm exploring, a dynamic, diverse, cosmopolitan, live city. It also had the largest percentage. It was one of the few, I'll put it this way, it was one of the few cities in the modern Jewish world to have a majority Jewish population. And I have to say, by way of digression, that congratulations are owed to Clémence, whose own book just came out, which I'm holding here in my hand, called Another Modernity. And Clémence is exploring another life of letters, which is that of a 19th century rabbi and philosopher who was of Livornese origin, but lived in Essaouira, Morocco, which is one of the other centers of the modern Jewish world at a time to have a majority Jewish population. So everybody look for Another Modernity, for another glimpse of Sephardic life. But so, of course, it's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
Pleasure. So Salonica has these unique aspects. It's a center of Ottoman life for 500 years. It is one of the rare places in modern Jewish history to have a majority Jewish population. This population is mostly made up of Jews of Iberian origin who left Iberia in the 15th century and thereabout, and after, in the course of exile, of expulsion. But not only, it's also an internally diverse Jewish community with Romano Greek Jews, with some Ashkenazi Jews, with Livornese and Italian Jews. And it's also a kind of international city because it's a commercial entrepot. There are consular representatives from many countries. But I think from the perspective of Jewish culture, we have to understand that this was a towering cultural center. There were other influential centers of Sephardic Jewry in the modern period, and I'm talking about the 19th and early 20th century for the moment. But Salonica is distinct because the percentage is so long. No, you were frozen for a moment, Clémence, but I think you're back. Okay. So okay, yeah. So this is partly why it is such an important place to examine. And it's also a city that is not just a Jewish city, even though there's a plurality of Jews there. Under Ottoman rule, it's a diverse city and a fascinating cultural environment. And Saadi's memoir that we were speaking about at the outset is one of the sources that really, I think, opened our eyes, historians' eyes, to the vivacity of this world. And it undergoes, in the course of the family history that I tell, Salonica undergoes a radical transformation, because it goes from being an Ottoman city and a plurality, or if not a majority, of Jews, to being a war-torn city and a city of refugees, to being a Greek city, and a city which is aggressively re-engineered by a state that is invested in transforming the city from an Ottoman to a Greek one, and in purging the visual and demographic presence of Muslims from the city, but also in lessening the imprint of Jews. And I describe this transformation, which takes place after the Balkan Wars, when the city shifts from Ottoman hands to Greek hands. And I think about how different members of the family I'm exploring, the Levy family, different members of the family reacted to that differently. Some people threw in their energies with the Greek state and were determined to take part in this transformation. Others really retained a very visceral, deep attachment to an old Ottoman world that they couldn't quite reconcile giving up. And that too influenced choices to migrate, choices to pursue citizenship in different directions, political choices. So it's a very complex transformation, politically, economically, but also emotionally, for this family and this community.
So that's that transformation, and how actually the family encapsulates the story of Salonica is a great segue into what I wanted to share with the audience, which are those pictures of the patriarch. So I hope that Samantha is going to be able.
Yes, Samantha was kind enough to allow us to share 2 images, and one of them is a portrait, a black and white portrait of Saadi, who I referred to before, Saadi Bezalel Ashkenazi Levy. Actually, Samantha, if we can start with the other one, we'll be grateful. We'll come back to this one in a moment. It's a portrait of Saadi taken in the late 19th century with the second of his wives. They are in a studio, a professional photographic studio, and they are wearing here the distinct clothing, male and female versions of which you can see here, the distinct clothing of Salonican Jewry, because Sephardic Jewry of the Ottoman lands of Southeastern Europe, while it had certain qualities that tied it together, there were also distinct local manifestations of Sephardic culture. And I know many viewers, I can see from some of the comments in the chat, come from this part of the world, and they will appreciate this well, that in clothing, in food, in dialect, and sometimes even in minhag, in practice of ritual, the Sephardic world isn't one, but many. So we see here a picture in a way of the older Salonica, although it's deceptive to say it was the older Salonica, because Saadi, the memoirist you see pictured here, was actually something of a radical. So much so that he is excommunicated in the 1870s by the religious establishment of Salonica. He's excommunicated because they perceive him as threatening the old order, really the old Jewish order. We might look at this photograph and see him as a glimpse of an old world, but he himself viewed the world with new eyes. And among the many things that he believed in was the importance of a Western-inspired educational model for Jewish girls as well as boys. And he and his wife sent his children to schools, girls as well as boys, and indeed sent one of his daughters all the way to Paris to be herself trained as a teacher. This is in the system I know many participants will know of, the Alliance Israélite Universelle. And she in turn was an educator who traveled extraordinary distances. This is Rachel, who I talk about in the book. So that is the first image that we share. And it is, as I say, both a snapshot of an older era, but also capturing somebody who is a catalyst for change, and himself embodying so much change that marked Salonican and Salonican Jewry's history.
Do you want to go to the next photo, Sarah?
Sure. I'm not sure if Clémence, are you there? Did we lose you to
no,
the perils of
absolutely. I think
Zoom?
that
Okay.
yeah, I think that would be wonderful if we could look at the way in which that transformation that he actually, pioneered happened, and how that shows even in the clothing or in the way his family related to traditions and clothing.
Yeah. So the second picture that we've selected for today takes a radical leap in time, from the late 19th century to the year 1917. But there's a lot that I think tease out for you in this astonishing photograph. Now, this photograph, I understand, is very dark. It's a bit hard to see in the book as on your screen. It is a reproduction of a very rare glass slide that a branch of the family, the Salem family, on the outskirts of Manchester in England, hold in their collection. And what you see here is a collection of the family standing at a very distinctive grave in the Cemetery of Salonica. That is the grave of Saadi Besalel Ashkenazi Levy, who we saw in the previous photograph. Now, his grave stands out in this cemetery. It is of distinct shape and size. It is particularly grandiose. It's a kind of symbol of the stature that he held within this community. The cemetery in which they're located was at the time the geographically largest Jewish cemetery in the world. Now, there were other cemeteries that were older. There were other cemeteries that held more graves. But this was spatially the largest Jewish cemetery. It was 86 acres, and it was located at the very center of the city of Salonica. Now, you see the family here. These are mostly members of the Salem family, the descendants of Fortuné Levy, who was one of Saadi's daughters. This family is visiting the cemetery at this moment because they are preparing to leave their native home of Salonica for Manchester. And they chose Manchester because, like Salonica, Manchester is one of the towering centers of modern textile production and trade in the world at this time. And this branch of the family was in the textile trade, and they were preparing to follow the eldest son to Manchester, who had already established himself. But it's a complex moment. Clémence, you pointed to clothing as something that we could talk about, but it's also a kind of trace of global politics, because this is the middle of the First World War. It is not long after the Balkan Wars have ended in 1912, after which the city became Greece. Immediately, 2 years later, again, Salonica is plunged into war. During the Balkan Wars, the city is full of refugees. During the First World War, the city is full of refugees and soldiers, many, many Allied soldiers who are stationed there. It is physically in tatters, and the economy is sort of going belly up. And what does the family do as they prepare for departure? But they go to pay their respects to the dead, and they capture the moment. And you can see that some of the family members are on the left. There are two men on the upper kind of right corner at the top of the tear who are not members of the family, but are actually the men who you would pay to help you conduct prayers if you went to the cemetery to pay your respects, perhaps because you yourself weren't capable, or perhaps you were consumed with grief, or for whatever, or you were simply engaging in active philanthropy to hire them. So that's who those two men are. But the other people who are pictured here and in the book, in other pictures taken from the same collection of slides, have dressed up for the occasion. And to loop back, Clémence, to the question you asked about clothing, one thing we can see is how differently they look than did the picture of Saadi and his wife in the previous studio portrait. They are elegantly dressed. The women on the left here are dressed in a kind of Western fashion style, with large brim hats, one of which has a silk flower on top, heavy coats, heavy long coats. What is gone from their outfits is the distinctive marking, the sartorial marking of Salonican Jewry. They have become, in a way, global citizens through their self-presentation, in a way, but not entirely, because here they are returning to that most Jewish of places, in that most Jewish of cities, the cemetery, to pay their respects. And I hate to fast forward too much, Clémence, but I do think while we have this picture up, we might return to it later, because I do think it's important to talk about the fate of the cemetery, as well as the fate of the family. But we could take it down and return to it later, or
no, you can just go ahead.
Well,
just
what
go
I
ahead.
want to say,
I think that's also, I mean, that picture captures so much of that transition and the fate of, you know, not just the family, but the city. So if you want to, there's no spoiler.
Well, I mean, what I want to say is that this book, Family Papers, which, you know, covers a whole century, from the mid to late 19th century all the way to really the 1970s. Of course, there is a devastating, extended, complex Holocaust section within the book. And we can talk about that in time, Clémence, when we are ready. But while this cemetery picture is up, I want to say that one of the devastating things that happens in the course of the Second World War, amidst so much devastation in Salonica, is that this Jewish cemetery is raised by the Greek municipality with the permission of the German occupying authorities. And this land in the middle of Salonica will become home to the new University of Thessaloniki. And the graves that you see here are scattered, desecrated, but also many of them reused for the building of new sites within a still war-torn and then post-war city. And one of those graves that is desecrated and reused in this fashion is indeed the grave of Saadi, which you see here, which is used as paving material in a walkway in a neighborhood perched on the hill above the center of Thessaloniki. And it will be found very recently, only as I was working with Aaron Rodrigue to finish our book on Saadi's life, it would be found, it would be as part of a project to reclaim these desecrated graves. A project that's jointly organized by the Jewish community and by the Greek Archaeological Society that's based in Salonika, and it will be found in fragment, and that fragment will be brought to the Jewish Museum where it can be seen today in that city.
So can we maybe, I think we can lose the picture for now, even though this is a picture that comes to you, you know, that stays with you. I would like to go back to those, I mean, the Balkan War years and the what you alluded to, the family members who were about to leave and go to Manchester. The story is, I mean, the story is also a story in which official documents and passports play a huge part. I mean, it's really a matter of life and death. And so how did it come about that the Levy family was able to get, you know, so many different documents, and how can you, you know, like, how did it become that tale of being scattered around the world just based on the fact that they got different passports from different cities, I mean, from nations?
It's an extraordinary moment that I think highlights the profound element of chance in history that it's sometimes easy to discount because historians are so thirsty for logic and order in their storytelling. But this is really a story of extraordinary chance which turns into a positive force for some and a negative force for others. And I'll explain the story to which you're alluding, which is something I also wrote about at length in another book of mine called Extraterritorial Dreams, which is about Ottoman Jews and their relationship, their long historical relationship dating back to the early modern period with the acquisition of foreign papers, including Spanish and Portuguese papers, which some of those participating in the webinar may again be pursuing or have acquired through a modern twist to this story. But this is an old history that dates back to the early modern period. I'll try to explain it briefly, but it pertains to a law of extraterritoriality, where the Ottoman state and states of Europe had agreements that said, we won't try your subjects in our courts, and we won't tax them, and we won't limit them. And for some people, especially merchants, this provided an opportunity. Aha, if you could get the protection of a foreign state, you could be saved a lot of money, and you could be saved a lot of hassle. So starting back in the early modern period, merchants, not just Jews, merchants of all stripes, start pursuing in the Ottoman lands these foreign papers, and they come to live under what's called an extraterritorial status. That is, they're not living in the state whose documents they hold. Well, if we fast forward to the 20th century and the time of the Balkan Wars, one of the things that's happening at that moment, and certainly in the First World War, is that states and people, ordinary people, are beginning to understand that a passport, legal documentation, is an incredibly important asset and tool in the modern world. It used to be, in Saadi's era, not only did people not carry passports, but they didn't even necessarily register their children, their births or deaths. They maybe registered them internally to the Jewish community, but there was no reason to register them with state. And if you traveled, you could get a kind of document allowing you to pass borders. But of course, people weren't traveling as much as they would come to travel anyway. So in the 20th century, papers really begin to matter. And they especially matter when countries are at war. And especially if one finds oneself in a country that is not one's own, and war is breaking out around you. So this is an abstract context, but let me tell you what it means for the Levy family. During the Balkan Wars, it's becoming clear that the Ottoman state, the Ottoman Empire, is going to lose control over Salonica. But there's a time at which it's not clear who, under what rule Salonica will be. Will it be Bulgarian? Will it be Greek? Could it be Jewish? Could it be an international city? These are all proposals that today might seem outlandish, but at the time they were being debated by Jews and others as the war was unfolding. And within this moment of ambiguity, lots of foreign consulates were in Salonica, and both the representatives of state and the individual Jews thought, maybe this is an opportunity. Jewish merchants thought there could be something to gain by getting a foreign paper, a foreign documentation, foreign citizenship. And the states thought, look at all these merchants. Maybe we can gain by bringing them into our fold. So there's this extraordinary moment in Salonica in the course of the Balkan Wars where lots of legal papers are given out. Spain gives them out, Portugal, France, Britain, the Austro-Hungary gives them out, Germany gives them out. And they are seductive for a lot of reasons. For some people, they seem like they offer economic promise. For some people, it's just a hedge. You're just casting a bet. For other people, it actually represents value. You might use it, but even if you didn't want to use it, it just seemed like a good idea at a moment of chaos. So families begin to pursue these papers, and within families, people take different courses because we all know how families are. they don't always agree. Members of the Levy family were no exception, and some members of the family got Spanish or Portuguese papers, and little did they know at this moment, 1911, 1912, little did they know what turns out to be true was that the passport you acquired at that moment, or maybe your family acquired a little bit earlier, could be a matter of life and death during the Second World War. And so there are some members of the family through into the mid-20th century who still who have Ottoman papers. There are some who have Greek papers. There are some who get Italian papers. There are some who have Portuguese papers. And Clémence, I suspect the one story that you're thinking of is that after the Balkan Wars, the Portuguese story, many members of the family go to Paris. For various reasons, Paris is an enticing destination for them, and it has one of the largest emigre Ottoman Jewish communities in Europe. aside from Manchester and London. And of the people who go to Europe, many will be there with a Greek passport. And because they have a Greek passport, they will fall prey to deportation when Paris is occupied by the Nazi regime. Of the many members of the family who are there, some flee to the south and manage to survive. The legal history gets very complicated, but one of the people who survives is a family member who is able to go to Portugal simply because he had this document that he had acquired years earlier during the Balkan War. So it's a long and meandering story, but I think really the takeaway is that legal history can be a matter of survival for these people. And their lives, one family member to the other, could hinge on these moments of kind of serendipity that no one could have predicted would be the passport to safety in, decades forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the tragedy of the family, what happened to people who migrated. But an important part of the book also is clearly the depiction of what happened in Salonica. The fact that also for family members writing letters, they didn't know for such a long time what happened. So they were, kept in the dark, especially I'm thinking of Leon in Brazil. So I'd like you to read a passage from the book.
I'd love to.
We have a few more minutes. That would describe that moment where Salonica, that was such, place of culture, was also, even before people got killed, books and Jewish artifacts were looted by the Germans. So would you read from the news page, the bottom of page 162,
Sure.
That starts from the news from home?
Sure.
Read a few pages, and I mean, ideally, you have time until page 165, where that's a story that was shared between his family and friends in Salonica and Rio.
Okay, so sure. I'll do my best. Sure. So this comes from a chapter entitled Daoud Effendi. Before I read, I'll explain. And the book is organized such that each chapter is about a person, and people's stories unfold over the course of a book, but there are some unusual people who only command one chapter. Daoud Effendi, about whom we're going to hear now, is a son of Saadi, and someone who stayed in Salonica his entire life until he's deported by the Nazis and breathes his last breath in Auschwitz, but was a luminary who worked first for the Ottoman administration and then as the position of most prestige for the Jewish community of Salonica. So that's the preface. So Daoud Effendi. The news from home, had it reached Leon's hands, that's Daoud Effendi's son in Rio, would have been bitter. After the occupation of Salonica, one of the first actions of the German authorities was to close the Jewish community offices and begin a systematic pillaging of the community's Jewish books, manuscripts, illuminated Megillot, scrolls of Esther, archives, Torah scrolls, and synagogue ornaments. The plunder extended to libraries, public and private, whose holdings German representatives had cataloged even before the invasion. Within a few weeks, the Rosenberg Commission had located nearly 4,000 volumes from 10 yeshivot, the 1,500 volume library of Salonica's rabbinic court, and the lending libraries of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, B'nai Brit, and Maison Laïque Française, whose holdings numbered collectively over 6,000 volumes. In addition, 150 Torah scrolls were stolen from synagogues across the city. Some were sent to Germany, most were ripped apart and burned. After watching his own collection of historical and encyclopedic works despoiled along with so much else, the Salonican Jewish intellectual Joseph Nehama lamented, quote, "At the moment, the Jewish community of Salonica, which prided itself on spiritual riches accumulated over half a millennium, is without books," unquote. In his testimony at the Eichmann trial, Isaac Nehama, no relationship to Joseph, recalled the city's learned men weeping in the aftermath of the pillaging, keening, these books matter above all else. At the same time, an intense famine was taking hold in Greece, and Salonica was hit hard. The famine had begun earlier during the war with Italy, and it intensified it after the German occupation, as the authorities claimed the nation's fresh food supply, including fish pulled from the sea. With Italy diverting wheat southward and Germany diverting it northward, prices for essential food in Greece, olive oil, beans, eggs, wheat, olives, skyrocketed. The bread supply was insufficient and irregular. Vegetables and fruits were rarely seen at market. Meat became an unheard of scarcity. By March of 1942, the Greek population was said to be in a, quote, very weakened condition with no promise of aid in sight from the Axis or neighboring countries. That same month, the secretary of the Italian representative in Greece lamented, quote, the sole occupation of the Greek people seems to be trying to find food in order to exist. Even the Swiss consul in Salonica could not get food. He confessed to his wife that over the course of a year of occupation, he had lost 40 pounds. When confronted with a picture of her husband, emaciated, his wife could scarcely recognize his likeness. Salonica's inhabitants starved their way through the early 1940s. Many Jewish families left Salonica in the early months of the occupation, particularly those who held foreign passports. The Levys remained at home, suffering through the famine with their Jewish and Christian neighbors, and they were in Salonica when the occupying authorities imprisoned the chief rabbi of Salonica, Tzvi Koretz, a German-speaking Jew of Galician background. The occupying authorities also arrested the leadership of the Jewish community and selected new representatives, installing Sabbatai Saltiel at their head. When the Nazi authorities pressured Saltiel to deliver a report on the organization, leadership, and assets of the Jewish community, to whom did the wartime president turn but the community's longtime chancellor, Daoud Effendi Levy? Reading Daoud Effendi's report today, one cannot help but feel that his punctiliousness and maybe even his pride got the better of him. Drawn entirely from memory, the report surveys the structure and function of the Jewish community from 1870 to 1940 and estimates the value of Jewish communal property on the eve of the 1917 fire, and again at the time of Daoud Effendi's writing. It breaks down this data further by estimating the value of Jewish communal property neighborhood by neighborhood. To the 79-year-old Daoud Effendi, the report may have offered an opportunity to showcase his knowledge and expertise. To the German occupying authorities, it would have read as a menu of spoliation. Certainly, the Nazis had other sources of information. They had been eyeing and assessing the wealth of Salonica's Jews for some time. Daoud Effendi's resurgence is unnerving. This was a risky time to be so accommodating, a point that was not lost on one so canny as Daoud Effendi. As if to offset his service to the Nazi occupiers, he managed to slip a portfolio of property deeds attesting to the rights of the Salonica Jewish community to a non-Jewish friend for safekeeping, or at least that was the story shared after the war between his family and friends in Salonica, Paris, and Rio. It is possible that the very papers Daoud Effendi hid are among those recently rediscovered in Thessaloniki in a safe deposit box untouched since 1943 and bearing the name of the Jewish community, or among the papers of a notary in Thessaloniki only now recovered.
Thank you. So we get, the first steps before the annihilation of the community. So in February 1943, the Nuremberg laws extended to Salonika, which had been under Nazi rule, direct German occupation. So the ghetto was built in a neighborhood that was, the ghetto was set up in a neighborhood built by Baron de Hirsch. And so it took a few months to liquidate basically Salonika. Can you talk a little bit about what happened to the Levy family and how their fate is really, again, is a sort of snapshot?
Sure. Yeah, and I know we're going to open the conversation up to the participants shortly, so I'll try to give a kind of bird's eye view of what happens next. The Levy family is deported to death camps from various locations around Europe, it should be said, from Paris as well as from Salonica. But majority of those who are deported are indeed in Salonica at the moment you described, Clémence. And they are deported in a series of transports. 3 to 4 generations of the family will die in the death camps. They are, like the other Jews of the community, put in the Baron-Hirsch ghetto, subjected to all kinds of deprivations and acts of inhumanization. Among the most shocking twists to this family's history is that there is a member of the family by the name of Vital Hassan who serves as a intermediary between the Jewish community and the SS. And he is tried after the war and accused by the Greek state of crimes against Greece, and indeed is sentenced to death and will be, as far as I can reconstruct, the only Jew in all of Europe who is actually killed by a state because of complicity with the Nazis. So the family's tragic history of dehumanization, spoliation, incarceration in the Baron-Hirsch ghetto, and deportation and annihilation weaves in and out in just chilling ways with the story of one cousin in the family who at the same time is a sadist of really extreme order, who is part of the machinery of death in this city. And I trace too in the book not only the history of victimization, but his really unmatched story of joining the perpetrators and seeming to flee successfully, just as the last Jews of Salonica are being deported, including Daoud Effendi and his daughter and his granddaughter. He will die among the oldest Jews of Salonica, surely to die in Auschwitz, along with one sibling, and his granddaughter, Eleanor, will, his granddaughter, Nina, her nickname is, will, oh, that's not her name, but in any case, his granddaughter will also die at the same time as a result of the same transport in Auschwitz. So the devastation is, as it was for so many Salonican Jewish families, was of astonishing scope. This community suffers among the highest percentages of annihilation of any community across Europe. And it will take, of course, decades, generations for the family to come to terms with what has happened, to learn what has happened, and to reconnect with one another and to rebuild after the war.
Yeah, so I think we are running out of time. There are so many other aspects, you know, the question of Israel, what is the fate of Sephardism, Sephardic culture, and how that became a contentious point between different family members. But I invite the participants to this seminar to actually read the book. And before reading the book, maybe asking questions. So I know that Samantha has probably collected them during our conversation.
Yes, I've been collecting the questions that have been coming in, but I encourage everyone still with us to please keep them coming. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A, so please take advantage of that. Let's start with this question from a viewer who wants to know a little bit about Sarah's research process and specifically what it was like meeting with the living family members.
Thank you to that questioner. So this book depended on my digging up all kinds of papers in formal archives and libraries around the world, but also papers that remain in family hands. And I am enormously indebted to branches of the family all over the world who welcomed me, into their homes, into their living rooms, into the boxes that they had preserved of documents. There's simply no way that this history could have been written without their participation, and certainly it would have lacked an intimacy with the people whose stories I was seeking to tell. The family is wonderful, and I enjoyed so much meeting them in all the countries and locations that I did. What really interests me is that, like any family, they have different relationships to their past. Some know a great deal, some know almost nothing. Some feel incredibly connected. Others feel it is, for them, an intangible and rather lost history. What I think was most moving to me in the end is how much, across the generations, how much this history does in the end matter. I see similarities in their lives and the lives of their ancestors, musical talents, the cut of cheekbones, a propensity for eye trouble. Even in people's nature, I can see a kind of repetition across time. And what has been very exciting for me after the book came out is that it has actually served as a force to reunite branches of the family that previously had not been in touch. So it seems to be spawning a kind of new life to the Levy family that I think they wouldn't have been able to sort of pull off on their own. So that's an exciting, unexpected repercussion of the book.
That's so interesting. And as a follow-up to that question, have others sort of discovered your book and then gotten in touch with you seeking ways
Well,
to...
as recently as this morning, I fielded an email from somebody who said they would be on this very call, and I will eagerly reply to them when we are finished, who represents a branch of the family that I was not able to find on my own. And this is not the first time it has happened that the historical trail grew cold for me. I knew they were out there, and then they in turn have resurfaced with papers and memories of their own, sometimes that run at odds with the conclusions that I've drawn in the book. So it shows you that a family history is still so much preserved by surviving generations and malleable.
Fantastic. So I wanted to thank you for sharing those photos with us. They were so striking and interesting. People are curious about the graphics in the book. If you shared any other maps or photos that that they could look at. If you happen to have one on hand now, I'd be happy to share my screen. Otherwise, we can just tease people with a blurry photo from just a physical book, encouraging them to buy themselves. But I think there's like a lot of interest in the photography from this period, and also just like getting a visual representation of the geography of the time.
Yeah, it is so arresting, really, to have these images at hand. And I'm not sure that I have the technological prowess to both speak to you and quickly pull up some of these images. But the book includes as many photographs as I could. Also some paintings that I discovered in family homes of ancestors. I also found wonderful material objects that didn't necessarily lend themselves to reproduction, but that taught me so much about the family. For example, there is a member of the family in South Africa that I have corresponded with for years, who had a beautiful silhouette cut in the image of her mother as she was leaving Salonica for England in the second decade of the 20th century. And something about that youthful souvenir made that woman's journey feel to me so human scale, such a sort of vivid act of adolescent excitement and risk-taking, and maybe also fear. So these are among the things that family members have, along with photographs. And there were some members of the family who were hobby photographers and had wonderful collections. Leon Levy's papers in Rio also contained all kinds of objects, former address books and passports and medical records. These are the ephemera of everyday life. And it was quite a task to read through them and to try to understand what they told and what they left out. It was also a passion of mine to try to reconstruct vividly the history of women who might not have left as robust a documentary trace as men often were able to.
Great, thank you. We have time for just one or two more questions. Here's one that just came in from our viewer, Gabrielle. Gabrielle wants to know if you believe that there was a propensity for family members to fully integrate with the countries that they chose to live in.
Yeah, it is a complex question. I think what's complex about it is that word fully integrate. After Salonica became Greek, there was indeed a temptation for some in the community to throw themselves in with the Greek state, and many did, and they served in all sorts of capacities that reflected their loyalty to this new state, while others emigrated and left, whether for political reasons or economic ones or just out of desire. And wherever they went, whether it was England, whether it was France, whether it was Brazil or India or Portugal, their paths took meandering routes. And I would say that, again, the challenging word there is fully. Now I think these people in many ways are, they became members of the societies that they joined, but this wasn't always true in that family history. There were, for the immigrant generation that came and also for their children, I think that there were barriers, emotional and also practical, that stood in the way of their sense of belonging. And that question of how do you know if someone belongs, and how do you know if they feel they belong fully, is a really delicate one for the historian to try to tease out. And the answer isn't always simple, and it's not always static. And sometimes indeed it changed over time. But what I would say to Gabrielle is also that's so striking is that loyalty to the past somehow stayed with them, even for those who did invest in their adopted country of choice.
Fabulous, thank you so much. I'm going to take one more question before wrapping this up. And actually we're getting a lot of questions of a similar nature. So this one comes from Anya. Anya says she just finished reading your book yesterday, and thanks you so much for presenting this. Anya's great-grandmother was born in Constantinople, and her sister married a Hassan. So the names are so similar to the names in your book that she wonders if you have any research tips, and if she could see if there is any connection between their families, and in general, how does one go about researching their Sephardic family roots?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and I definitely encourage you to do so. The Hassan is a family name, is actually quite common across the Sephardic world. So at first gasp, I would say it's probably unlikely from Istanbul to Salonica that it is the same family. It's not impossible, but probably unlikely. There is a wealth of information online. The number of family trees that have been put up due to genealogical sites, things like the Jewish Museum of Rhodes and Jewish museums of various description, archives of Holocaust museums and Jewish museums around the world have put an enormous amount of material online. So especially under pandemic, I would say you can really have amazing success finding your connection to other families through online research and genealogical websites. I have edited a book called Sephardi Lives, which offers documents about Sephardic daily culture, which contains a lot of family names and histories. And that is another way I know some people who have reconnected with their family trees. But I think that while the field of Jewish history had ignored Sephardic history quite appallingly until recently, which is a whole other topic, we are fortunate right now that there is a lot of wonderful scholarship and writing, not only scholarly, but popular, and online resources that I recommend. And I have a website, sarahastein.com that also has some questions if you're looking for family history, if you found family papers and you want to know how to treat them and handle them. So take a peek there in case there's some information for you too.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I'll be sure to include a link to your website, Sarah, in my follow-up email, in addition to a link to the recording of today's program. As a reminder, all of Museum public programs are recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. So look out for my email, most likely tomorrow afternoon. I want to thank you both again for joining us and giving this fabulous presentation. I'd like to echo some of the sentiments in the chat. This was really so interesting. And if you want to learn more about this unique and in-depth history, please go out and purchase Sarah's book. It's called Family Papers, A Sephardic Journey Through the 20th Century, out now with all digital booksellers. I'll include a link to that, the purchase link as well in my follow-up email. And thank you both again. This was really wonderful.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Samantha. Thanks, Clémence.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Clémence.
everyone who
Thank you, Sarah.
participated.